When the Hawker Typhoon first roared into the skies, it was not greeted as a savior of the Royal Air Force. Instead, it was feared by its own pilots. Designed as a replacement for the Hurricane and a counter to the German Focke-Wulf FW-190, the Typhoon began its life burdened with flaws that seemed to doom it from the start. Its thick wing, massive Napier Sabre engine, and hasty design choices created a machine that was fast and deadly on paper, but unstable and unreliable in the air. The aircraft's reputation as a widowmaker spread quickly across RAF squadrons. Pilots joked grimly that the only thing faster than a Typhoon was the speed at which its tail might fall off. The early failures were devastating. Structural weaknesses in the rear fuselage led to several fatal in-flight breakups. Carbon monoxide leaked into the cockpit, causing pilots to lose consciousness mid-mission. The Sabre engine, though immensely powerful, was temperamental and required constant maintenance. At low altitudes, the Typhoon was fast, but it could not climb with the Spitfire, nor could it dogfight at higher altitudes. The aircraft that was meant to defeat the FW-190 seemed incapable of doing so. Many RAF officers wanted it scrapped entirely. But as the war changed, so did the Typhoon's destiny. The Luftwaffe began relying heavily on ground support operations and low-level attacks, and the Western Front filled with German armored vehicles. The RAF needed a fast, durable aircraft capable of delivering devastating firepower against tanks and troop columns. The Typhoon's flaws, its weight, its thick wing, its enormous engine suddenly became virtues. Near the ground, where other fighters struggled with drag and instability, the Typhoon thrived. Its rugged airframe could absorb punishment, and its four 20mm Hispano cannons tore through enemy armor. The accident-prone interceptor was reborn as a ground attack killer. By late 1942, the RAF's 609 Squadron began experimenting with rocket projectiles, unguided but terrifying weapons that could demolish tanks, trucks, and even locomotives. The Typhoon's ability to carry 8 RP-3 rockets transformed it into a flying artillery piece. Each rocket carried a 60-pound warhead, capable of punching through several inches of armor or exploding with the force of a small bomb. For German troops caught in open terrain, the scream of incoming Typhoons was a death sentence. Soldiers described the sound as a mix between thunder and tearing metal, an omen that death was seconds away. Then came the tactical innovation that would define the Typhoon's legacy, the cab rank system. RAF controllers in forward positions, using radio beacons and mobile transmitters, could summon Typhoon squadrons circling above to strike specific targets. Like taxicabs waiting for a fare, the Typhoons loitered until ground forces called them in. Within minutes, they dove from low clouds, releasing rockets and cannon fire with surgical precision. This combination of speed, flexibility, and coordination turned the Typhoon into one of the most feared aircraft of the war. German commanders quickly learned that any exposed convoy risked annihilation from the sky. The Typhoon also earned another role hunter of the V-1 flying bombs that terrorized British cities. In the summer of 1944, when the first V-1s began streaking across the Channel toward London, the RAF needed an aircraft that could intercept them at low altitude. The Typhoon's immense power and speed near the ground made it the perfect candidate. Pilots learned to spot the V-1's distinctive pulse jet flame, dive upon it from behind, and open fire. Some, to avoid the risk of explosion, developed the astonishing tactic of using their wingtip to flip the bomb's gyroscope, sending it spiraling harmlessly into the countryside. Between June and August 1944, Typhoon pilots destroyed hundreds of V-1s, saving untold lives. The machine that had once been a liability had become indispensable. The RAF now relied on it for close air support during the Normandy invasion, the Falaise Pocket, and the drive into Germany. Low-level attacks by Typhoons crippled Wehrmacht logistics and demoralized entire divisions. German tank crews began abandoning their vehicles at the mere sight of the distinctive broad wings and the shark-like intake of a Typhoon, approaching at treetop height. It was said that nothing unnerved the German soldier more than the growl of a Sabre engine echoing through the valleys of France. The statistics tell the story of this transformation. Between 1943 and 1945, Typhoons flew over 20,000 sorties. They destroyed thousands of vehicles, hundreds of tanks, and dozens of locomotives. In just 1 week during the Normandy campaign, Typhoons of the 2nd Tactical Air Force claimed more than 200 tanks destroyed and another 250 damaged. Their rockets shattered bridges and road columns, isolating German units and forcing retreats. The aircraft's once questioned strength, its low-altitude performance had become the decisive factor in the Allied advance. Among the pilots, legends emerged. Squadron leader Johnny Baldwin of 609 Squadron became one of the RAF's top Typhoon aces, with over 15 confirmed kills and dozens of successful ground attacks. His daring low-level strikes against enemy convoys became textbook examples of Typhoon tactics. Another, Wing Commander Roland Beaumont, was instrumental in developing the aircraft's rocket armament and later led the first Tempest wing in operations over Europe. These men transformed a troubled machine into an instrument of precision destruction. But the evolution didn't stop there. The Hawker Tempest, developed from the Typhoon's foundations, would take the concept to its ultimate expression. Engineers refined the wing design, reducing drag and improving high-speed handling. The fuselage was streamlined, the tail strengthened, and the engine tuned for maximum reliability. The result was one of the fastest piston engine fighters of the war, a machine capable of exceeding 430 miles per hour at low altitude. The Tempest inherited the Typhoon's thunder, but delivered it with grace and control. When the Tempest entered service in 1944, it immediately demonstrated its superiority. Against the V-1 flying bomb, it proved even deadlier than the Typhoon. Its acceleration and speed allowed pilots to chase down the robot bombs and destroy them with pinpoint accuracy. Some pilots achieved extraordinary tallies. Flight Lieutenant Joseph Berry, flying Tempests from RAF Newchurch, destroyed 59 V-1s in just 2 months. His exploits made headlines across Britain and inspired countless others to join the fight against Hitler's vengeance weapons. Beyond the V-1 campaign, the Tempest became a terror to the Luftwaffe. In air-to-air combat, it could finally match and even exceed the FW-190 in speed and climb at low altitudes. Over the Netherlands and northern Germany, Tempest wings hunted German fighters and jet bombers with ruthless efficiency. The aircraft's agility allowed it to ambush Me-262s as they landed or took off, moments when the jet's slow acceleration made it vulnerable. RAF records show that Tempest squadrons destroyed at least 20 Stahlheller's Me-262s in this way, a testament to their precision and courage. Tempest pilots also carried the cab rank doctrine forward. Using improved radio coordination, they could respond to forward air controllers within seconds. The combination of RP-3 rockets, 20mm cannons, and high speed meant that a single Tempest flight could decimate an armored column in minutes. The Germans came to call them the Jabbo Kings, short for Jagdbomber fighter bomber. Their sudden, deafening attacks left wrecked convoys and smoking tanks along Europe's roads. Psychological reports from captured German soldiers described the sheer terror of seeing Tempests descend from cloud cover, their rockets screaming like banshees before striking. Even the Wehrmacht's most hardened panzer crews developed superstitions about the aircraft. Some refused to light campfires or move in daylight, fearing that the faintest movement would attract the black-winged devils. Others reported phantom sounds of the Typhoon's Sabre engine long after the planes had passed. In truth, the Tempest's Rolls-Royce Griffin and Napier Sabre engines could be heard from miles away, and their arrival often meant annihilation for anything caught in the open. By the late summer of 1944, the reputation of the Typhoon and its successor, the Tempest, had reached legendary status among both friend and foe. Allied soldiers on the ground cheered at the sight of the aircraft sweeping in low over the hedgerows, their distinctive cannon fire echoing like rolling thunder. The men knew that the arrival of these machines meant relief from German counterattacks and an almost guaranteed destruction of enemy armor. For many infantrymen, the Typhoon had become an angel of vengeance, its rocket trails marking divine intervention on the battlefield. German soldiers, however, viewed it differently. Survivors of typhoon attacks spoke of sheer chaos, the earth exploding beneath them, tanks erupting in flame, and entire columns reduced to smoking debris within minutes. Even when the rockets missed, the psychological shock was enormous. German reports from Normandy describe units abandoning vehicles at the mere sound of the typhoon's approach. Some commanders tried to camouflage their positions with foliage or smoke screens, but the Typhoon's pilots became masters at spotting subtle movement, glints of metal, or dust clouds from engines. Once identified, escape was almost impossible. Pilots like Group Captain B. Beaumont pushed the limits of what could be achieved with a piston-engine aircraft. He led formations through intense flak and unpredictable weather, often flying just meters above treetops to avoid radar detection. The Typhoon's speed at low altitude gave it an unmatched ability to surprise enemy convoys. Beaumont recalled in his memoirs that the rockets left the rails with a scream that cut through the wind's roar, and a second later, the earth below would erupt into fountains of smoke and fire. You could almost feel the shock wave through the cockpit. The use of RP-3 rockets was both an art and a science. They were notoriously inaccurate individually, but devastating in salvos. Pilots learned to fire them in pairs, adjusting for range and wind drift. Experienced squadrons developed techniques to saturate target areas, bridges, supply depots, or tank formations with overlapping rocket spreads. Each aircraft carried 8 rockets, meaning that a single squadron could unleash more than 60-pound warheads in a single pass. The effect on the battlefield was overwhelming. Photographs from reconnaissance flights often showed roads choked with burnt-out vehicles, testaments to the Typhoon's destructive power. The tactical doctrine surrounding these strikes became increasingly sophisticated. The cab rank system, where Typhoons circled above front lines, waiting for direction, proved invaluable during the Normandy campaign. Forward air controllers, known as Rover Davids, operated in jeeps close to the action, using radio beacons to mark targets. They could call in Typhoons within minutes, coordinating attacks with artillery and tank movements. The combination of aerial power and ground coordination turned the RAF's 2nd Tactical Air Force into one of the most flexible strike forces of the war. During the Battle of Falaise in August 1944, this system reached its peak. As German forces attempted to retreat east through narrow corridors, Allied aircraft descended upon them in waves. Typhoons attacked relentlessly, day after day, obliterating convoys trapped in the Falaise pocket. Post-battle surveys estimated over 150 tanks destroyed, hundreds of trucks, and countless soldiers killed or wounded. The landscape was left littered with wreckage and craters. Even though later analysis suggested that not all tank kills could be directly attributed to rockets, many were finished off by artillery or sabotage. The psychological and logistical damage inflicted by the Typhoons was undeniable. The Wehrmacht's retreat turned into a rout. The Typhoon's transformation from a failed interceptor to a precision strike weapon was complete. Pilots who had once distrusted the aircraft now swore by its reliability. Mechanics learned the quirks of the Napier Sabre, mastering its maintenance and coaxing its full 2,200 horsepower into dependable service. The tail-strengthening modifications eliminated structural failures, and cockpit improvements, including better ventilation and armor, made it a safer environment for pilots. The once cursed fighter had earned its redemption through fire and steel. But while the Typhoon was still dominating over France, the next evolution was already taking shape in Hawker's design offices. The Tempest emerged not as a radical reinvention, but as the perfect refinement. The goal was to address the Typhoon's weaknesses, its thick wing, high drag, and limited high-altitude performance, while retaining its devastating low-level capability. The result was a masterpiece of British engineering, sleek, fast, and lethal. The Tempest's new laminar flow wing reduced drag dramatically, allowing the aircraft to achieve over 430 miles per hour at low altitude. It handled beautifully in high-speed turns and climbs, giving pilots confidence they had never felt in the Typhoon. The fuselage was lengthened, the tail redesigned, and the canopy improved for visibility. Pilots described the transition as stepping from a brute force hammer into a precision blade. Yet the soul of the Typhoon remained the sheer aggression, the roar of the Sabre engine, and the relentless focus on low-level dominance. When the Tempest entered combat in early 1944, it was immediately thrust into one of Britain's most desperate defences, the battle against the V-1 flying bombs. These buzz bombs raced toward London at over 400 miles per hour, powered by pulse jet engines that gave them their haunting, stuttering sound. Few aircraft were fast enough to intercept them. The Tempest, however, could match their speed and had the endurance to patrol over southern England. Pilots soon became experts at the dangerous art of V-1 hunting, approaching from behind, firing carefully to avoid premature explosions, or tipping the bomb's wing with their own to destabilize its guidance system. Flight Lieutenant Joseph Berry became the ace of aces in this deadly contest. In just 2 months, he shot down 59 V-1s, a record unmatched by any other pilot. His dedication and daring became a symbol of British resilience. Others followed in his footsteps. Tempests from squadrons based at Newchurch, Lympne and Manston formed a shield that dramatically reduced the number of bombs reaching London. By the end of the V-1 campaign, Tempest pilots had destroyed more than 600 of the flying bombs, saving thousands of lives. After the V-1 threat subsided, Tempests turned their attention back to occupied Europe. By late 1944, the skies over the Netherlands and Germany were filled with chaos as the Luftwaffe struggled to defend shrinking territories. Tempest squadrons, many formed from veteran Typhoon units, became the scourge of German airfields and transport lines. Their speed made them perfect for rat-catcher missions, intercepting low-flying enemy aircraft and hunting anything that moved on the ground. In air-to-air combat, the Tempest finally gave RAF pilots the advantage they had long sought against the FW-190 and Bf-109. It could outdive, outrun, and outturn most German fighters below 20,000 feet. Combat reports from 3 Squadron and 486 New Zealand Squadron tell of Tempests ambushing enemy aircraft during takeoff or landing, where the Germans were most vulnerable. Against the new jet-powered Me-262, the Tempest proved one of the few Allied aircraft capable of engaging effectively. Pilots would patrol near known jet bases, waiting for the Me-262s to return. As the jets slowed to land, the Tempests would swoop in, guns blazing. This tactic, though dangerous, resulted in dozens of confirmed kills. The psychological effect of the Tempest on German troops mirrored that of its predecessor. Soldiers began referring to them simply as Tiefangriff Teufel, low-attack devils. Convoys that once traveled by day now moved only under cover of darkness. Bridges were abandoned, supply lines severed, and communications disrupted. German morale plummeted as the skies filled with Tempests and Typhoons, symbols of Allied air supremacy. Each sortie added to the growing legend. The numbers were staggering. By war's end, Typhoon and Tempest squadrons had claimed over 9,500 vehicles destroyed, including 1,500 tanks. They conducted more than 23,000 ground attack missions and flew nearly 200,000 operational hours. The cost was heavy, hundreds of pilots and aircraft lost, but the strategic impact was immeasurable. The destruction of Germany's mobility hastened the collapse of its armies on the Western Front. The human stories behind those numbers are equally remarkable. Many pilots were barely in their 20s, flying at treetop height through storms of flak and gunfire. They returned to base exhausted, their aircraft riddled with holes, only to refuel, rearm, and take off again within hours. Some wrote brief notes before each mission, knowing it might be their last. Flight Lieutenant David Ince of 193 Squadron once described his emotions before a sortie. "You learned to live minute to minute. The noise, the fear, the heat. It all blurred into one sensation: purpose. We were part of something immense, and the Typhoon carried that weight with us." Others found strange beauty in the chaos. Squadron leader Pierre Clostermann, the French ace who flew Tempests with 3 Squadron, captured the feeling perfectly in his book The Big Show. He wrote of the terrifying elegance of a Tempest dive, the moment when the Earth rushed up and rockets screamed away, followed by the instant of silence as smoke filled the sky. Klosterman himself achieved 33 victories aircraft and ground targets combined, and became one of the most celebrated Allied pilots of the war. Pierre Klosterman's vivid accounts of Tempest operations brought the experience of low-level combat to readers around the world. He described the aircraft as both brutal and beautiful, a machine that demanded total concentration and absolute courage. The Tempest, he wrote, was not a plane for hesitation. It was a beast of prey, and the man at the controls had to become part of it. His words captured what many pilots felt: the union between pilot and aircraft, between man and machine forged in the furnace of combat. For Klosterman and his comrades, every mission began with a quiet ritual. They would gather in the briefing room, maps spread across tables, as intelligence officers outlined target supply depots, bridges, or troop concentrations. Weather reports were studied, radio frequencies confirmed, and flight formations assigned. Then, after a final cigarette, the pilots would walk to their aircraft, engines already warming, propellers slicing the damp morning air. The Napier Sabre, or Rolls-Royce Griffin engines roared to life, their deep growl reverberating across the airfield. Within minutes, the squadron was airborne, climbing into the grey European sky. Low-level flight in a Typhoon or Tempest was an exercise in controlled chaos. Flying barely 50 feet above the ground, at over 350 miles per hour, pilots had to navigate terrain, trees, and enemy fire simultaneously. The slipstream of another aircraft could flip a plane if formations were too tight. Anti-aircraft fire burst around them, bright flashes that seemed to hang in the air for an instant before vanishing. Pilots spoke of the surreal beauty of sunlight reflecting off rivers and the blurred motion of fields rushing beneath them, all while knowing that a single mistake meant instant death. Targets appeared suddenly: a column of trucks on a road, a train steaming through a valley, or a tank battalion trying to cross a bridge. The leader would call out coordinates, and the squadron would roll into attack dives. The sky became a storm of motion rockets streaking away, cannon shells striking home, and explosions rippling across the landscape. Each pass lasted only seconds, but those seconds defined lives. Many pilots described the sensation of time slowing down, their minds processing every flicker of light, every burst of smoke with crystalline clarity. When they pulled out of their dives, they could see the wreckage below, black smoke rising, flames consuming fuel and ammunition, and the road littered with twisted metal. The success of these attacks wasn't just due to bravery, it was also the result of a new level of precision and coordination. Ground controllers used portable radar beacons and direction-finding equipment to guide Typhoons and Tempests to within a few hundred meters of their targets. Allied troops on the ground used colored smoke or flares to mark enemy positions, and the pilots adjusted their runs accordingly. This integration of air and ground tactics foreshadowed modern close air support doctrines. In many ways, the Typhoon and Tempest were the ancestors of the jet-era strike fighters that would dominate post-war battlefields. By 1945, the RAF's 2nd Tactical Air Force had become one of the most efficient killing machines of the war. The coordination between air power, artillery, and armored units created a seamless web of destruction. German generals later admitted that Allied air superiority embodied by the Typhoon and Tempest was one of the main reasons for their defeat in France and the Low Countries. General Hans von Luck, a panzer commander, recalled that, "Once the Typhoons appeared, all movement by day became impossible. They broke the backbone of our armored divisions." The legacy of these aircraft also lived in the men who flew them. They were not anonymous figures in machines. They were individuals with stories, fears, and triumphs. Many were veterans of earlier aircraft like the Hurricane or Spitfire. Others were fresh from training, thrust into combat with only a few hours of flight time on the type. The learning curve was brutal. The Napier Sabre's immense torque could flip the aircraft on takeoff if the throttle was applied too quickly. Engine fires were not uncommon. And yet, despite the risks, morale remained high. Pilots took pride in their work, knowing that every tank they destroyed, every train they derailed, brought the war closer to its end. The camaraderie among these squadrons was legendary. Evenings in the mess were filled with laughter, music, and the ever-present clinking of glasses. They celebrated every safe return and mourned every loss. When a pilot failed to return, his name was often chalked onto a board, followed by the simple word missing. There were no speeches, just silence. But the next morning, the squadron flew again. The Tempest also became a symbol of technological mastery at the end of the piston era. Its performance at low altitude rivaled the first generation of jet fighters. Engineers at Hawker pushed every mechanical limit, extracting speed and endurance that seemed impossible only a few years earlier. In test flights, Tempests reached speeds exceeding 440 miles per hour at sea level, making them among the fastest propeller-driven aircraft ever built. The precision of its flight controls, the stability of its guns, and the sheer reliability of its structure made it the perfect bridge between the old world of piston engines and the coming age of jets. As the Allies pushed into Germany in early 1945, Tempest squadrons took part in one of the most relentless air campaigns of the war. They destroyed rail lines, strafed convoys, and hunted retreating forces in what became known as the Hunters' Months. German morale was shattered. In one report from March 1945, a captured Wehrmacht officer described how our men now look to the skies before they move. The Tempest comes without warning. By the time we hear its engine, it is already firing. For many on the ground, the aircraft became a symbol of inevitability, the sound of defeat itself. Even as the Luftwaffe introduced the Me-262 jet fighter, the Tempest found ways to counter it. By patrolling near airfields like Rheine, Hopsten, and Lippstadt, Tempest squadrons caught the jets as they landed or took off. Their quick acceleration and superior maneuverability at low speeds gave them the edge in these ambushes. Between January and May 1945, Tempests claimed over 20 Me-262s destroyed, often in daring close-range engagements. It was a fitting final challenge, the last great duel of the propeller age against the dawn of the jet era. As victory approached, many Tempest pilots reflected on the transformation that had occurred since 1941. The Typhoon, once dismissed as a dangerous failure, had evolved into one of the war's most successful and feared aircraft. The Tempest, its heir, had perfected everything the Typhoon had pioneered. Together, they changed the way air power supported armies on the ground. The concept of the fast, heavily armed, low-level strike fighter would influence generations of aircraft to come from the Hawker Sea Fury, to the English electric Canberra, and even the modern Tornado. The war's end brought mixed emotions. Many pilots, still in their early 20s, faced the sudden silence of peace after years of constant flight and danger. Some found it difficult to adjust. Others joined the test programs that would lead to jet fighters like the Hawker Hunter. A few continued to fly Tempests in peacetime service, patrolling occupied Germany, or training new aviators. The aircraft remained in use well into the late 1940s, earning respect wherever it flew. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Typhoon and Tempest lies not in their technological achievements or kill counts, but in the psychological warfare they waged. Their very presence changed the battlefield. They gave the Allies a visible, audible symbol of dominant steel angels that struck fear into the heart of the enemy. For the soldiers who fought beneath their wings, they represented salvation. For those who faced them, they were doom made flesh and metal. In the post-war years, historians and engineers alike continued to marvel at the Typhoon's unlikely resurrection. It was a reminder that innovation often begins with failure, that the machines that change history are not always the ones that start perfectly, but the ones that evolve under pressure. The Typhoon had begun as a flawed interceptor and ended as the backbone of Allied tactical air power. The Tempest carried that torch to perfection, proving that the principles of speed, power, and adaptability could reshape the face of modern warfare. Today, restored Typhoons and Tempests stand in museums, their wings bearing the scars of battle. Few original Typhoons survived, as many were scrapped after the war. But their memory lives on in the words of those who flew them. "She was a brute," one veteran recalled, "but she was our brute." When you flew the Typhoon, you knew you were riding the storm. The transformation of the Typhoon from a troubled prototype into a hunter of FW-190s, a destroyer of tanks, and a defender of London, is one of aviation's greatest redemption stories. And the Tempest, its final evolution, stands as proof that perfection is not born. It is forged through trial, courage, and the relentless will to improve. As Europe burned and rebuilt in the aftermath of war, the legend of the Typhoon and Tempest began to crystallize, not in the roar of engines, but in the recollections of those who had flown and faced them. Pilots who once strapped into these machines as young men now spoke of them with reverence, their voices carrying both pride and sorrow. They remembered the vibration of the Napier Sabre at full throttle, the smell of oil and cordite, the sudden flash of tracer fire streaking past the canopy. For them, the Typhoon and Tempest were not just machines of war. They were living companions that had carried them through hell and brought them home again. The engineers at Hawker, led by the brilliant Sidney Cam, looked back on the Typhoon's troubled birth with a sense of vindication. Cam had fought fiercely to keep the program alive when critics called for its cancellation. He believed in the design's potential, believed that its power and durability could be harnessed for something greater. Time proved him right. The Typhoon's evolution into the Tempest was not merely an improvement. It was the culmination of everything Cam had envisioned for a high-performance ground attack fighter. His team's work laid the foundation for decades of Hawker aircraft to come. At the same time, the pilots of the Luftwaffe who had once battled these aircraft spoke of them with reluctant admiration. Many German fighter aces admitted that the Typhoon was among the most dangerous opponents they faced at low altitude. Its speed and firepower made it a deadly adversary in hit-and-run attacks. The FW-190, originally designed to dominate below 20,000 feet, found itself hunted by the very aircraft it had inspired. "You could not shake them," one German pilot recalled. "They came in low, very fast, and their cannons tore through armor and wings like knives through paper." The Typhoon's reputation as a tank buster, though sometimes exaggerated in popular accounts, was still formidable. Post-war analyses revealed that while individual rocket hits on tanks were rare, the cumulative effect of Typhoon attacks was devastating. Even when rockets missed, the near misses could destroy tracks, damage suspension systems, or kill exposed crewmen. More importantly, the psychological effect was immense. Panzer divisions halted in fear of air attack, making them vulnerable to artillery and ground assaults. Typhoons didn't just destroy tanks, they paralyzed entire formations. Historians studying the Normandy campaign later concluded that the Typhoon's greatest contribution lay in its disruption of German mobility. By crippling bridges, railways, and supply routes, the aircraft made it impossible for the Wehrmacht to coordinate an effective defense. A single Typhoon squadron could isolate an entire division within hours, turning Germany's once feared blitzkrieg tactics against itself. The hunter had become the hunted. Meanwhile, the Tempest's achievements continued to grow in legend. By the final months of the war, Tempest squadrons were operating deep inside Germany, conducting armed reconnaissance missions that blurred the line between air combat and ground warfare. They attacked trains, vehicles, and airfields with impunity, their speed allowing them to evade interception even from jet fighters. The last great air battles of World War II often involved Tempests dueling with Me-262s in the skies over northern Europe, a symbolic clash between eras. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Tempest's story is how well it bridged the technological divide between propeller and jet aircraft. While the Me-262 and Gloucester Meteor represented the future, the Tempest showed how far piston engine technology could be pushed. Its acceleration, stability, and precision at high speed were unmatched. In many ways, it was the pinnacle of piston-driven design, a machine so advanced that it could still hold its own against the earliest jets. Even after the war, test pilots used Tempests as chase planes during jet trials, praising their reliability and control. The aircraft also left a lasting mark on the evolution of aerial tactics. The cab rank concept first perfected by Typhoon and Tempest squadrons became a cornerstone of modern close air support doctrine. The idea that aircraft could orbit the battlefield, ready to strike on demand, influenced not only post-war British and NATO operations, but also later conflicts from Korea to the Gulf War. The system's combination of radio coordination, ground observation, and airborne flexibility was decades ahead of its time. It represented a fusion of technology and human skill that transformed warfare forever. The individual heroics of Typhoon and Tempest pilots continued to capture imaginations long after the war ended. There was Flight Lieutenant Richard Dick Audette of 198 Squadron, who achieved one of the most extraordinary feats in air combat history, shooting down 5 enemy aircraft in a single sortie over Germany in December 1944. His victims included 2 Bf-109s and 3 FW-190s, all destroyed within minutes. Tragically, Audette was killed only weeks later. His Tempest struck by flak during a low-level attack. He was just 23 years old. Then there was Squadron Leader Keith Skeets Ogilvie, a Canadian who had been shot down in a Spitfire earlier in the war, captured, and later escaped from a German POW camp only to return to combat as a Tempest pilot. His courage and determination embodied the spirit of the aircraft he flew. Resilient, unbreakable, and unyielding. The Tempest's final wartime missions came in May 1945. Even as Germany crumbled, the RAF continued to patrol, striking remaining pockets of resistance. On the last day of hostilities, Tempests of 80 Squadron attacked enemy vehicles near Lubeck 1 of the final combat operations of the European War. Hours later, the guns fell silent. The Tempests returned to base, their wings streaked with grime and powder, engines ticking as they cooled in the spring air. For the men who had survived, it was a strange silence, one filled with relief, disbelief, and the haunting memories of all they had endured. After the war, the Tempest served briefly in the RAF's occupation forces and later in several foreign air forces. India, Pakistan, and New Zealand all operated Tempests in the years following 1945. In the skies of post-colonial Asia, the aircraft once again demonstrated its versatility, this time as a peacetime patrol fighter. But by the early 1950s, the jet age had arrived in full. The Tempest, like the Typhoon before it, was retired, its thunder fading into history. Yet its influence lived on. The Hawker Sea Fury, developed directly from the Tempest lineage, became one of the finest naval fighters of all time. It carried the same DNA, the powerful radial engine, the clean lines, the balance of speed and strength. Sea Furies would go on to serve in Korea, where they famously shot down MiG-15 jets in dogfights that echoed the Tempest battles with the Me-262. The legacy of CAM's design endured through every generation of Hawker aircraft, culminating in the jet-powered Hunter, and eventually the Harrier. In the decades that followed, the Typhoon and Tempest faded from public consciousness, overshadowed by the glamour of jet aircraft. But among aviation historians and enthusiasts, their reputation only grew. Restoration projects in Britain and Canada sought to resurrect these machines, piecing together fragments from wrecks and forgotten airfields. The discovery of a nearly intact Typhoon fuselage in Normandy reignited global interest. Engineers and volunteers worked tirelessly to restore it to flight condition, a tribute not just to the aircraft, but to the men who flew it. For those who witnessed these restorations, hearing the Napier Sabre roar again was an emotional experience. The sound, deep, throaty, and unlike any other, seemed to carry the ghosts of the past. Veterans who stood beside the runway as the engine started wept openly. To them, it was as if the spirits of their comrades had returned for one final flight. The Typhoon story, once marked by tragedy, had come full circle. From a flawed prototype that killed its own pilots to a weapon that broke the back of German resistance, its journey symbolized the resilience of human ingenuity. The Tempest, born from its lessons, became the embodiment of perfection through perseverance. Even in the 21st century, the name Typhoon carries weight. The modern Eurofighter Typhoon, one of the world's most advanced multi-role jets, proudly inherits the title. Though separated by generations of technology, it shares the same philosophy as its ancestor: dominance through speed, power, and adaptability. In a poetic twist, The modern Typhoon now flies with RAF squadrons, once equipped with the same squadron numbers, the same emblems, the same spirit of innovation. If the old pilots could see it, they might smile. They would recognize the lineage not in shape or sound, but in purpose. The mission remains the same, to control the skies and protect those below. And so the story of the Hawker Typhoon and Tempest is not merely a tale of metal and machinery. It is a story of redemption, courage, and transformation. It is a testament to what happens when failure is not accepted, when persistence turns disaster into triumph. From the low clouds of Normandy to the silent airfields of post-war Europe, their legacy endures in every aircraft that follows their contrails across the sky. The storm they brought was not just one of destruction, but of change. The story of the Typhoon and Tempest remains one of contrast between failure and triumph, chaos and precision, brute force and refinement. These aircraft were born in desperation, forged in the crucible of total war, and perfected through relentless adaptation. Their impact went far beyond the statistics of tonnage destroyed or missions flown. They represented a new idea, that air power could be flexible, responsive, and intimately connected to the ground battle. When historians examine the transformation of the Royal Air Force between 1940 and 1945, they often describe it as a revolution. At the start of the war, the RAF was an air defense force, its focus almost entirely on intercepting enemy bombers and protecting Britain's skies. By the war's end, it had become a tactical hammer that could shape the battlefield itself. The Typhoon and Tempest were at the heart of that change. The cab rank concept, those circling squadrons waiting for a call from forward air controllers, was a forerunner of modern precision air support. The radios, beacons, and ground-air coordination developed for Typhoon and Tempest wings were the ancestors of the systems used by modern JTACs and KAS aircraft. In the 1940s, it was revolutionary. Commanders in the field could summon near-instant airstrikes, not from distant bomber fleets, but from fast, heavily armed fighters hovering just beyond sight. Even the way targets were marked reflected innovation. Typhoon pilots often described seeing columns of colored smoke rising from the battlefield green for friendly units, red or yellow to mark the enemy. Sometimes, as the situation shifted, those smokes mixed chaotically. The pilots had to decide in seconds which way to turn, which side to fire on. The risk of friendly fire was real, but the coordination became increasingly precise as pilots and ground forces learned to trust one another. For the soldiers below, this partnership meant survival. Infantrymen who advanced through the bocage of Normandy or across the frozen plains of Holland often spoke of looking to the sky for protection. "When we heard the Typhoons coming," one British tank commander recalled, "we knew we weren't alone anymore." The roar of the Sabre engine was both comfort and terror comfort for the Allies, terror for the Germans. Psychologists studying wartime morale later noted how powerful the Typhoon's psychological impact had been. Its distinctive profile and sound became symbols of doom for Axis troops. Some Wehrmacht reports even referred to Typhoon shock, a form of battle paralysis where soldiers froze or abandoned their positions under attack, even when no direct hits occurred. German propaganda tried to downplay these effects, but frontline diaries tell another story. "Every time we moved," one officer wrote, "the Typhoons found us. It was as if they could smell fuel and fear." The Tempest amplified this effect. Faster, sleeker, and deadlier, it arrived at a time when the Luftwaffe was collapsing. German pilots who managed to take off in Mi-262s or FW-190Ds found themselves hunted by aircraft that should by all rights have been obsolete. Yet the Tempest's low-altitude performance and heavy armament made it a match for any opponent. Its 4 Hispano cannons delivered devastating bursts, and its control response at high speeds gave it an edge even against jets in specific conditions. One of the most famous encounters occurred on April 10, 1945. A Tempest patrol led by squadron leader D.C. Fairbanks intercepted a group of Mi-262s near Celle. Diving from above, Fairbanks and his men caught the jets as they attempted to land. In a daring attack, they shot down 2 before the rest could escape. It was a testament not only to pilot skill, but to the Tempest's agility and acceleration at low level, a piston fighter defeating the future itself. These victories, however, came at a cost. The life expectancy of a Typhoon pilot in 1944 was measured in weeks. Low-level flight exposed them to flak, small arms fire, and the ever-present danger of mechanical failure. The Napier Sabre engine, though powerful, remained temperamental. Many pilots perished not in combat, but through accidents or forced landings. Maintenance crews worked around the clock to keep squadrons operational, often cannibalizing parts from damaged aircraft. The smell of hot oil, scorched paint, and cordite became part of daily life. Despite this, morale among Typhoon and Tempest units remained remarkably high. The sense of mission, the knowledge that their actions directly supported troops on the ground, gave the pilots purpose. They were not distant bombers raining destruction from miles above. They were visible, immediate, and personal. Soldiers recognized them, waved at them, and wrote about them in letters home. The connection between air and ground, between pilot and infantryman, became almost spiritual. The pilots themselves often described the peculiar duality of their experience. In the air, they were detached professionals, focused entirely on speed, range, and precision. On the ground, the reality of what their attacks meant would sometimes catch up with them. "You saw what was left afterwards," recalled Flight Lieutenant Jeffrey Page. "Burning vehicles, men running. It wasn't glory. It was necessity." By war's end, those necessities had changed the very nature of air warfare. The Typhoon and Tempest had proven that speed and firepower could turn the tide of ground battles as effectively as any tank division. The RAF's Tactical Air Command became a model for future conflicts. In Korea, Vietnam, and later in the Gulf, aircraft would perform the same missions only now, with guided bombs and computer targeting. But the principles were the same ones forged by Typhoon and Tempest pilots over Normandy. In retrospect, it is remarkable how closely the evolution of these aircraft mirrored the evolution of the war itself. The Typhoon's early struggles reflected Britain's desperation in 1941 and 1942, a nation experimenting under fire, trying to keep pace with an enemy that seemed unstoppable. The Tempest, arriving in 1944, represented the opposite: control, dominance, mastery of both sky and ground. Together, they tell a story of transformation from vulnerability to overwhelming strength. Even today, the memory of the Typhoon's impact endures in the places where it fought. In Normandy, local villagers still remember the low-flying RAF fighters that saved their towns from German reinforcements. Farmers plowing their fields occasionally unearth fragments of rocket rails or ammunition casings, relics of that summer when the sky itself seemed to burn. At museums like Hendon and Duxford, restored sections of Typhoon fuselages stand as silent witnesses to the cost and courage of that era. Only one complete Typhoon, pulled from a crash site and painstakingly restored, remains as a tangible reminder of the storm that once swept across Europe. Each rivet tells a story. Each scar on its armor plate whispers of the chaos it survived. And so, the Typhoon and Tempest endure not merely as machines of war, but as emblems of resilience. They teach us that progress is born from failure, that mastery comes only through perseverance. They remind us that behind every technological breakthrough lies a trail of human struggle, risk, and sacrifice. When the engines roared to life and the pilots pushed the throttles forward, they carried more than weapons. They carried the weight of hope. Hope that their flight would change the course of the battle. Hope that the roar of their Sabre engines would mean freedom for those below. The Typhoon entered the war as an experiment and left it as a legend. The Tempest perfected that legend, soaring faster, striking harder, and leaving a trail of shattered steel and broken resistance in its wake. Together, they were more than aircraft. They were storms given form, thunder made of metal. And when they vanished into the clouds, the echo of their engines lingered, a reminder that even in the darkest days, the storm can bring light. The final chapter of the Typhoon and Tempest saga unfolds not in combat, but in memory. How these aircraft came to represent an era when the boundary between man and machine blurred in pursuit of survival and victory. In the years after the war, as nations rebuilt and veterans returned to lives of uneasy peace, the echoes of the Typhoon's thunder still resonated in the minds of those who had flown it. For them, it was more than just an aircraft. It was a symbol of their youth, their courage, and the relentless pace of innovation that defined the 1940s. For decades, the Typhoon remained something of a forgotten hero. Overshadowed by the Spitfire's grace and the Lancaster's fame, it had no cinematic glamour. No romantic dogfights high in the clouds. No iconic Battle of Britain legacy. Its war had been fought low and dirty, at treetop height where mud, shrapnel, and smoke blurred the line between air and earth. Yet among those who studied the war's tactical dimensions, the Typhoon's role was undeniable. It had changed the way wars were fought. Post-war assessments by the RAF and Allied Command recognized the Typhoon's unique contribution. The reports from the 2nd Tactical Air Force spoke with awe about its effectiveness during the Normandy breakout and the destruction at the Falaise Pocket. Intelligence officers credited Typhoon strikes for reducing German armored divisions' mobility by as much as 70%. Whole panzer regiments, once symbols of Nazi invincibility, were rendered helpless by the roar of Sabre engines and the scream of RP-3 rockets. The pilots, for their part, remained fiercely loyal to the machine that had both endangered and saved them. Many who had cursed its quirks and training later admitted that nothing else could have done what the Typhoon did. It was like strapping yourself to a bomb, one pilot said, but once you learned to control it, you were unstoppable. The aircraft demanded respect and rewarded mastery. Every successful mission was an act of precision and nerve. By contrast, the Tempest earned immediate admiration. It combined power with elegance, transforming the raw aggression of the Typhoon into something almost refined. Pilots transitioning to the Tempest described it as a thoroughbred descended from a warhorse. The controls were smoother, the cockpit visibility superb, and the speed breathtaking. It had none of the Typhoon's erratic temperament, yet it retained its spirit, the low-level menace, the ferocity in attack, the unmistakable sense that the aircraft wanted to hunt. In the closing months of the war, the Tempest achieved feats that bordered on the mythic. In one mission, Flight Lieutenant Pierre Klosterman chased down a Focke-Wulf 190 at treetop height over the Rhine, his Tempest tearing through the valley at nearly 400 miles per hour. He later wrote that the landscape blurred into streaks of green and gray. You didn't see the ground, you felt it. The dogfight lasted less than 2 minutes. The German fighter, unable to shake the faster, heavier British machine, finally pulled up too sharply and stalled. Klosterman's guns flashed once, and the 190 disintegrated in mid-air. Stories like these spread across the RAF mess halls, adding to the Tempest's growing legend. Pilots began to speak of the aircraft as if it were alive, temperamental, yes, but loyal and courageous. Its deep growl at takeoff was described as the sound of a lion waking. Even among jet pilots in the post-war era, the Tempest retained a mystique. "You never felt like you were flying it," one veteran said. "You felt like you were holding onto it, and it took you with it." As Europe transitioned into the uneasy peace of the late 1940s, both aircraft slowly disappeared from the skies. The Tempest lingered longest, serving in training roles, reconnaissance missions, and even early Cold War patrols. Some found their way to the Indian Air Force, where they flew until the early 1950s. But by then, jet fighters had arrived, the Meteor, the Vampire, and soon the Hunter. The age of the propeller had ended, and the Tempest was the last of its kind. Still, its influence endured. The design lessons learned from both the Typhoon and Tempest shaped a generation of engineers. The laminar flow wing of the Tempest became a standard feature in later aircraft, and its robust airframe inspired the development of high-speed, low-level strike fighters for decades. The concept of a fighter bomber capable of both air superiority and ground attack missions evolved directly from these wartime pioneers. Sidney Cam, the man behind their creation, continued to push the boundaries of aeronautical design. He would go on to design the Sea Fury, the Hunter, and eventually contribute to the Harrier jump jet lineage of aircraft that can trace their DNA back to the Typhoon's daring blend of power and practicality. In interviews later in life, Cam often spoke fondly of the Typhoon's troubled beginnings. "It was never meant to be perfect," he once said, "but perfection rarely wins wars. The Typhoon was built to fight, and that it did better than anyone expected." In Germany, the aircraft left an indelible mark of a different kind. Farmers and villagers who had survived Typhoon and Tempest raids still spoke of the angry roar that filled the sky before the rockets fell. For them, it was the sound of defeat, but also, paradoxically, of liberation. In places like Falaise and Caen, local memorials include plaques honoring both Allied airmen and the civilians caught in their firestorms. The Typhoon's legacy, like war itself, is complicated, both destructive and redemptive. In Britain, for years, few monuments existed to commemorate Typhoon crews. Many had perished without graves, their aircraft vanishing into forests or fields across Europe. It was not until the early 21st century that dedicated efforts began to recover and restore these machines. The discovery of a Typhoon wreck near the French village of Beaulieu in 1998 reignited public interest. Over the next decade, restoration teams worked meticulously to rebuild it from fragments. When the aircraft's engine finally turned over again, veterans gathered at the airfield, tears in their eyes, as the deep, guttural rumble of the Sabre engine filled the air once more. For many, it was the sound of youth returning after half a century. Museums across Britain and Canada began to collect Typhoon and Tempest relics. At the RAF Museum in Hendon, the recovered tail section of a Typhoon sits beside letters and photographs of the men who flew them. Visitors often stop in silence before the display, struck by the juxtaposition of metal and memory. One caption reads simply, "This machine was once feared by the enemy and by those who flew it." In Normandy, a full-scale Typhoon replica stands as a memorial near Noyers-Bocage, overlooking the fields where so many were lost. Every year, on the anniversary of D-Day, wreaths are laid beneath its wings. Children who were not yet born when the last Typhoon flew now learn the names of the pilots who fought and died there. Names like Baldwin, Beaumont, Ince, and Klosterman. Their stories have become part of the land itself. The psychological shadow the Typhoon cast on the German army is now a subject of military study. Historians have traced how its presence forced changes in Wehrmacht strategy. Movement by day became nearly impossible. Fuel convoys were shifted to night operations, and even then, roads had to be concealed under trees or camouflaged netting. Armored divisions could no longer maneuver freely, breaking the very doctrine that had once made them unstoppable. In this way, the Typhoon achieved what no tank could. It took away the enemy's mobility. It made them prisoners of their own terrain. When modern air forces teach close air support, they still refer to the RAF's 1944 operations manual pages, filled with lessons learned by Typhoon and Tempest units. The principles remain remarkably consistent: flexibility, communication, and speed. The technology has changed, but the human element, the bond between air and ground, remains the same. And so, decades later, when the Eurofighter Typhoon entered service, it did so carrying a legacy that few modern jets can claim. Its name was not chosen by accident. Engineers and commanders wanted to honor the aircraft that had turned the tide in 1944. The new Typhoon, with its twin engines and digital avionics, is everything its ancestor could never be: stable, reliable, and supremely agile. But beneath the carbon fiber and stealth composites lies a spiritual connection, a lineage of purpose. If the old pilots could stand beneath its wings, they might hear echoes of their own past in the whine of the turbines. They might smile at the irony that the name once associated with risk and imperfection had become synonymous with precision and control. In that transformation lies the full circle of history. The Hawker Typhoon began as an aircraft that tried and nearly failed to be something it was not. It was born to fight in the air, yet it found its true calling against the ground. It was flawed, fierce, and human, much like the men who flew it. The Tempest took that raw energy and gave it form, discipline, and grace. Together they shaped not only battles, but ideas that would guide the next century of flight. Their thunder has faded, but their legacy remains written in the skies they once ruled. Each time a modern pilot streaks low across a battlefield, guiding precision munitions onto targets with the aid of radios and controllers, the spirit of the Typhoon and Tempest flies again. It lives in the sound of the engines, in the courage of those who fly close to the ground, and in the eternal lesson they left behind. To master the storm, you must first fly through it.